Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are in the Johnson edition. We turn now to poem 545. "'Tis one by one the Father counts." God as teacher, God as mathematician. It is a fascinating poem because in many ways it's another poem about learning. Again, as we've said in our very early comments about Emily Dickinson, we are calling our series Chats with Emily. Our assumptions are that you've been with us at LearnStrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, again, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've worked through our set of introductory comments where we talked about Emily as instructor, Emily as teacher, Emily as enlightener. And I'm hopeful as well that you've worked through our previous 544 poems. We just finished with 544, The Martyr Poets Did Not Tell. And if you have, then you'll be able to, you'll hear echoes, resonances in this poem of what has come before. Now, Emily here is going to talk about a school, but she's going to be referencing what the school of life, in other words, the way that we are educated. Now, as we said in our introductory comments to Emily, her own education is quite fascinating. We'll not get into it all here, but it is remarkable. What she knew, what she was introduced to in the few years that she was in some formal schooling in her later life, and then how she continued to self-educate. But now, she turns that gaze towards each of us as, what is it Mandela calls us, God's children. "'Tis one by one the Father counts, and then a track between set cipherless to teach the eye the value of its 10, until the peevish student acquire the quick of skill, then numerals are dowered back, adorning all the rule. 'Tis mostly slate and pencil, and darkness on the school distracts the children's fingers. Still the eternal rule regards least cipher alike with leader of the band, and every separate urchin's sum is fashioned for his hand." Now I can't help but think of the Matthew 25 passage that, and maybe standing behind this, the idea of the parable of the talents, as it's sometimes referred to, where the argument is it doesn't matter what kind of talent you have as long as you are trying to exploit or use that talent in some profound way. And in other words, God is allowing, the Father is allowing for that to happen in its own way, in its own time. Notice, if we begin by one, in other words, she argues, God doesn't look at his class of students and see them all as a simple collective. Each one of us, one by one. I think Emily's going to make the argument that we all come to our learning in our own way and in our own time and in our own pace, right? 'Tis one by one the Father counts, and then a tract between set cipherless to teach the eye the value of its 10. I think value is the key word here. In other words, some jump further ahead than others very quickly, until the peevish student. It's an interesting, the idea that God can be patient with the student who is peevish, who is not so ready, right? Acquire the quick of skill. Now, some have read this poem as Emily's commenting on her own development as poet. In other words, it took her a long time to be able to come to the kind of poet that she ultimately is. Then numerals are, it's interesting, dowered, right, back, adorning all the rule. In other words, it's not unusual to see students, she says, who start out peevish, not so high performing, and then all of a sudden they begin to figure it out. 'Tis mostly slate and pencil, to remind, of course, that Emily's early education and the time that Emily lives, you would have a slate that you wrote on with a pencil or with crayon or with chalk, and darkness on the school. This is the school of life. In other words, not everything is so obviously clear. The darkness distracts the children's fingers. In other words, we could make the argument that pain or suffering sometimes keeps children from learning what they need to learn. Still, the eternal rule, and of course the eternal rule here would be a reference to the Father or to God. Now, I think standing behind this is Plato's Republic 7, and the idea, his pedagogic ideas, we've given full lectures at LearnStrong.net. I'm hopeful that you can run that to ground. The idea that you're sitting in the darkness of a cave, you must be brought out of the light of the sun. That takes time and energy, and of course pain and fear are an analog to all of that learning. Regards least, as in God, the eternal rule, regards least cipher alike. In other words, there's no comparison with leader of the band. In other words, you have the one in front, the leader of the class, if you will. Here she calls it the band, the top student. Nobody, God is not expecting all of the lesser than students to acquire or come as quickly to the front of the band, the leader of the band. And every separate, now here she'll call him an urchin, earlier it was peevish, urchin's sum is fashioned for, and I think that's a key word, for his hand, God, for God's hand. What's the point here at 2a? I think her argument is that in God's eyes, everyone matters. All students matter, I think, is the argument she's making. At 2b, well, the word picture of the school of life, I think, is profound here in doing mathematics. At 3a, I mentioned, of course, Republic 7, but I can't help but think of Walt Whitman, the contemporary, although they never met, Song of Myself, passage 46-47. We've given full lectures on it at learnstrong.net. We call that series Chats or Talks with Walt. You'll remember the destroy the teacher passage. He most honors my style who learns under to destroy the teacher. The goal, of course, of the teacher is to prepare the student for that great walk of life or that great swimming of life. Finally, at 3b, what was a lesson that you have learned in the school of life? And maybe it didn't come as quickly. Some of you are reporting learning to read Emily is kind of in that vein. Thank you.